because we're not too far from Valentine's Day. So it really seemed appropriate to load up this presentation with a lot of things about love and passion. There's even going to be some poetry. I'm warning you ahead of time that this is going to be, I think, a lot of fun. You might already be familiar with this conservation quote. It's pretty famous. The person it's attributed to is Baba Diem. He's a Senegalese forestry engineer, and he's a tireless advocate for African farmers. So it's kind of odd to me that mostly I see this in a marine context, in a marine conservation context. But I think it's because it's really based on a universal truth, which I think we sort of found out with the Chico Basin project, that once people really experience something like a Chico Basin, once we know something like the birds, we develop a deeper appreciation and love for it. And he said, in the end, we will conserve only what we love love only what we understand, and we will understand only what we are taught. Jacques Cousteau, in explaining why he made undersea films, picks up on a really similar theme. People protect what they love, yet we love only what we know. And that really got me to thinking about, how do we know birds? And can we, through appreciating bird art and making our own, can we gain a deeper understanding of birds that grows into something that amounts to conservation and caring? And I think it has been true for me. And I hope it'll be true for others too. Most bird art that we encounter falls under this really broad natural science illustration category. It's a big field. It includes everything from information about bugs to the human heart to anything that falls into the natural sciences. It's a very vibrant field, still really relevant. You'll still see a lot of illustration. And then under that big umbrella, you can find things like the field guides that we use. Some bird portraiture would fall into this category. And I think our own nature journaling is part of this tradition. It's often defined as art in the service of science. I think it's messier than that, just like a good relationship. It's not always just art in the service of science. Sometimes it's science in the service of beauty and aesthetic goals. But science illustrators are really good at simplifying complex information with scientific accuracy and rigor. Elizabeth Gould was John Gould's wife. He was the famous British ornithologist and author. She did his illustrations and did his plates for him. And this goshawk, this New Holland goshawk, was done sometime before her death, but she had 8 kids. She had to have been in love with what she was doing to try to make that set of relationships work. 100 years earlier, Maria Sibylla Marion was a German entomologist. She was an adventuress. She made and sold her own paints. She was a publisher. She copper etched her own plates from her paintings. She was just an incredible, amazing, interesting woman. One of the things that she was able to do was really push the science forward in terms of understanding metamorphosis. She traveled to Suriname in 1699 with her daughter and illustrated, documented, collected a lot of insects. She would crate them. She would raise these insects. She would collect the caterpillars, figure out what the host plant was, feed them, and then do her illustrations and her documentation from that. So she is able to describe in one plate, not just the behavior and the form of the insect, but also the process of growth and development. These are things that illustrations are capable of that can sometimes be hard to see in a photograph because there's a lot of distracting additional information in photos. So natural science illustrators can distill that down into just the basic information that they want to communicate, either to a scientific audience or to the general public, which is often the case. For example, with field guides, that's probably where we encounter illustrations most often if we're birding. They have the diagnostic information that we're looking for ID, for bird ID, but also they have some other really cool stuff. And, you know, maybe I'm saying things that people are totally familiar with here, but I tend to use my bird guides out in the field and I sort of skip some of the really cool stuff. This is from David Allen Sibley's second edition field guide. And one of the little drawings that I like to go back to often are all of his really simple looking, but hard, I think really hard to produce line drawings of feather groups. I mean, think about what has to be behind that. You're distilling a lot of really complex scientific information into something really basic for the general public. And to make that readable and clear and easy to understand takes a lot of talent and a lot of research, I think. And of course, there are thousands of hours of research and field observation that go into any field guide. Sometimes you can actually get additional behavioral information, not just what the bird looks like, but how it might look in different positions. This was important to me to see when I was illustrating the long-eared owl, because Risa had given me some really good photos and she captured both of these postures. And I'll show you that later. But there's a camouflage and an active posture. I wasn't familiar with this bird at all when I started illustrating it. So this was a really key piece of information that I ended up needing. And then in field guides, you have to include just the right details. So I have been watching videos of David Allen Sibley talk about his work. You can see these on his website. There was a CBS This Morning segment about his new book, What It's Like to Be a Bird. I think I got the title wrong, but I'm sure you guys are all familiar with it. His plates, if you watch that segment, they look to me to be about 16 inches by 20 inches, which means that they get reduced quite a bit when they go into the book. And somewhere on his website, he's doing a process video, and he talks about including just the amount of detail that's necessary for ID. And I have to think that part of that decision is also because it's going to be reduced so much. Also, details take time. And if you're doing a field guide, you're doing hundreds and hundreds of illustrations. You don't have time to noodle over every feather. So these are constraints and choices that get made that make the field guides, I think, a really interesting artistic work too. I haven't done much field guide work. This is one piece that I did as part of a class project. And I just wanted to show you some of what goes into this, because in all of the kinds of illustrations I'm going to talk about tonight, except maybe your journals, there's so much more that happens before you ever get to actually rendering the final piece. So often I'll start out with something like a plant family guide, which is a work of art in its own right with lots of wonderful pen and ink illustrations. And that guide to flowering plant families has a lot of technical jargon. So then I also need an illustrated dictionary to go with it. I will use herbarium specimens, which are these beautiful, these are also works of art. These are beautiful mounted specimens that are collected. There are lots of Colorado plants that have been turned into herbarium specimens up at the Denver Botanic Gardens. Some of them are 100 years old. And the person who mounts them will often put them into the plant habit, which is just sort of the shape of how it grows, so that you really get a sense of what that plant is like in life. And then it's up to the artist, if we're going to illustrate from that, to try to revivify it and make it look like it's actually alive. Something else that we do is to carefully measure and dissect plant material. This is part of just the sciencey part of getting the illustration done. This isn't the same plant that I'm going to show you in a second, but it's the only photo I have of doing that sort of work. There are always also, for me at least, because I'm not a botanist, there have to be scientists in the background checking what I do to make sure that it's accurate. And then finally, I might render it in something like pen and ink because it's very clean. So you will see a lot of natural science illustration done in pen and ink. It's easy to reproduce. You don't get distracted by color. It's easy for the eye to read. I think of bird portraiture a little bit differently. It sort of falls into this natural science illustration category. But again, those messy goals of art and science kind of get turned on their heads a little bit, at least in the work that I do. I want my birds to be scientifically accurate, but I do a lot of bird portraits where the aesthetics are maybe more important to me. And I see a lot of beautiful artwork like that from other artists. I have total freedom because I'm not doing it for publication, or I can publish it myself. And so I can really push ideas and emotions and stories that I might want to tell with it. I can work on trying to elicit some emotion in the viewer and to hopefully make people curious about the subject. And that's where I try to sneak in a little bit of conservation work. Can I push people to really care about the subject in a way that might lead them to something more? These are all different little stories that I've tried to tell. And you know, there's also a question of, do we want our bird portraits to be anthropomorphic in any way? Do we want them to seem human? If I'm telling a story, sometimes I do. The screech owl that had been hanging out at the park just looked like the most self-satisfied bird I'd ever seen. So I really tried to push its facial expression. I think the little gnatcatcher looks curious. To me, that quiet hummingbird is also territorial. It's gonna fight for its territory, sitting up there on the branch, looking around. I try to leave it also open for the viewer, but there's always a little story in the background. So we can do this ourselves. You don't have to be an artist. You don't have to have what you think of as good art skills. If we can write our names, we can draw. Making letters is drawing. So no excuses. And remember that your journal is for you. You don't have to share it. I'm going to invite you to make some art in a minute. And it's up to you if you want to share it. But also your journal is a place to record observations, and not just things you see, things that you hear, taste, feel. It's just a beautiful record of, it can be of a space or a place. You can put maps into it. And when we better understand nature, it's really enjoyable. And also just, I find working outside or even working at a window, looking at the bird feeders, which is something Anna Joy mentioned, we all get to sort of spend more time doing these days. It's just keeps us present, lowers the blood pressure, can be a lot of fun. I love the work of William T. Cooper. He's an Australian bird illustrator, did a lot of field guide work, worked in oil painting. And you can watch him on YouTube too. He passed away in the last few years, but he had this really great book that I have. I stress that nothing helps more than really knowing your subject. Looking is one thing, seeing is another. An artist needs to see, and the best way to learn is to draw. So I'm going to challenge you with that. The best way to learn really is to draw. And as we all sort of want to build our birding skills, sometimes the best way to push that learning forward is to take some time and maybe study one species by drawing it and really start to see some of those field marks or compare two species. I had a class that I took very early on. I'm an adult art learner. I did not learn as a child. And I was taking classes at DBG, sitting next to this young man. And we both had, I think the whole class had this epiphany all at the same time. And out of the blue, he shouts out into the quiet of the class, "Oh my gosh, it's not about drawing, it's about seeing." So when you do art, this is something that an epiphany that you can have. So what I want to do now is challenge all of us to do some really simple, loose, fun, relaxing exercises that are going to engage the hand, the eye, and the brain. And we're going to get a little help from the alphabet and a little help from my niece, who is my niece, Sophie. She's very, very good at abstracting. And she taught me something that I want to share with you. And then we're gonna sketch from some photos. Okay, so I'll show you this more than once. Well, actually, we don't need to see it more than once, but this is when you're gonna get your pencils out. So if you're not ready, don't worry, there's time. Here's the letter U turned into an owl. Check that out. 2 connected U's. This is what I learned from my niece. And all I want you to do is just loosely make some letter B's. We can all make the letter B, make them forward, backward, fill your page. Think of this as just warm up. These are going to become birds. So the letters we're going to work with are the letter S, the letter B, the letter U. Make it fun, go big. Make them on top of each other, backwards, forwards. See if you can make them respond to birds of different species. Can you make one that looks like a robin? You can add eyes and bills if you want. Sometimes I sit and look at the bird feeder and just make these shapes. And I let my brain, it turns off that other voice in your brain, the critic. If you want, you can experiment with holding your pencil a little bit differently. You might see artists doing this. It's loose. Sometimes you have less control, but can be a little more expressive. There are those owls again. I'm gonna make a great horned owl. And then maybe I'm gonna try to make a long-eared owl. Maybe some shorebirds. I was drawing this with one hand and filming with the other. It felt like I was trying to write backwards. Okay, so how did that feel? Hopefully that felt not too stressful. Let's take another step in the direction of drawing some birds. And again, we're just gonna try to get that internal critic out of the way. I think of this next process as drawing a map of a treasure island. And what I want to do is get the coastline down. Because the next step is going to be to put some landmarks on. But for now, just try to make your shapes respond to the actual bird in the photo. All right, so kind of drawing around, but trace it on your page. I'll show you that one more time. And don't worry if you don't finish, you can't get all 5 birds in by the time I change to the next thing. We don't want to be stressed. You should have something that looks like this. And believe it or not, there's a lot of information in here. So imagine that you are sitting at your window, looking at your bird feeders, and you want to try to sketch from life. You need 2 things. You need a shorthand that you can transfer to your page that is quick. So we're going to talk about a couple of strategies for that. The other thing you need is to build your memory so that when you glance up at a bird that is going to be gone in half a second, you can retain as much information as possible and put it on the page. So if this is all I can get from what I see at my bird feeder, I'm still pretty happy. I've got the posture. I've got sort of the size of the head versus the body, size of the body. So I actually have some good information there. But of course we can add a little bit more. So this time we're going to start with those shapes and then we're going to add in some landmarks. So if the outside of the bird is the coastline of my treasure map, the eyes, the line of the bill, the top of the wing, something about the feet and the length of the tail, those are my landmarks. And eventually I'm going to use those to go, 6 paces south, 2 paces east to get to the next treasure. So let's look at that one more time. I'm going to give you some other pictures to work with too, but just try this on your page. You might notice that the eye of the bird, when you can actually see it, falls a little bit above the line of the bill. So the center of the bill, the eye is usually just a little bit above. So that's something to look for. And when you're done, again, you've got a lot of information. I've got posture, I've got wing position, I've got feet. So this is an exercise that has value in and of itself, even if you never get to drawing any more of this bird. Okay, I'm gonna let you have a little more time with this set of pictures, but I wanna show you a couple more strategies for doing this. Typically, a bird artist is not gonna start with the B shape like this. That's something I developed for myself because it was fast and I wanted to share it with you. A typical artist of any kind starts with what they call a gesture drawing, which is usually a couple of circles on some sort of axis. And then on top of that, they put all of their marks. You can do that if you want. John Muir Laws, who I'm gonna show you his website later, he's a naturalist and a fabulous teacher of nature journaling. He brings that axis out along the back of the bird and then drops his circles from there and then puts his landmarks in. So that's also a good technique to try. So use anything that you like. I'm gonna show 3 slides with a handful of birds on each slide. We'll start with this one that you're already familiar with. And then I'm not going to give you any warning about changing from slide to slide though. Don't panic. This is just like looking at the bird feeder. They're going to be gone. So we'll give you about 30 seconds. At this point, you might be filling your page and might feel like you need a new page. Oh no, now we're looking at the water. Here's where an S might be an interesting choice. Can you record on your page something about that bird with a different letter of the alphabet? Maybe some other letter of the alphabet speaks to you. It's up to you.
Christine, what was the name of that naturalist that you just mentioned a minute ago?
John Muir Laws, L-A-W-S, as in Sam. I'm going to show you his website later, but yeah, he's great. This might be where you get those letter U's. Maybe this is the letter B again. I had never noticed before how small the golden eagle's head is compared to its body. That's something fun to capture. So if you feel, hopefully you enjoyed that. And if it felt a little bit of frustrating because you didn't have as much time as you wanted, I'm going to give you more time with this next bird. I've also posted a blog post on my website, and I have some of these same pictures at the end of it if you scroll way down. So you can take all the time you want later. But often we don't have that much time. So these techniques of sort of getting started, creating your treasure map, and then mapping in your landmarks, that can get you at least most of the way there. And then you can put details in all day long. So I'm going to show you a really short, I'm going to have to show this multiple times because I had to do a kind of a stop action thing. So the other piece of advice I want to give you is keep those beginning lines as light as you can. In this Zoom context, it's hard for me to show you anything if I do it that lightly. But those beginning circles or the B shape, whatever you choose, you want it to be super light because you're going to make more firm, confident marks on top of that. And I want to share with you just a couple of techniques that we use in drafting. So let me put this back. We often measure, sometimes I just get out a ruler, literally a ruler, and I measure from one landmark to the next. So it's really important to get your first angles as close as you think you can, and then get some sort of a landmark in there. And from here you can measure. And so I can sort of decide as I'm drawing, it's perfectly acceptable and necessary to make adjustments. There's no right or wrong, good or bad. You just may need to make adjustments. So you sort of check, did I get the distance right between the eye and the bill? I might take out my ruler and measure that. Sometimes it's a flower and I have the flower in the studio and I literally measure the flower. If I'm working life size, then I don't have to do any fractions to enlarge or reduce. I can just measure and transfer that to my page. So what's this angle? Have I matched it? Sometimes we'll take our pencil and we'll measure something like the head that we've drawn. And we'll say, all right, compared to the head, how big is the tail? Is it roughly the same length? And then you just transfer that down. So hopefully that's clear what I'm talking about. I'm going to give you a chance to draw this yourself. I'm going to give you 3 or 4 minutes. It'll feel like a luxurious amount of time. And so that we don't have a lot of dead air while you're working, I'm going to read a couple more quotes. This is from William Cooper. You can just let this wash over you. Listen with one ear while you draw with your hands and eyes. Cooper says, when I was young, even before my teenage years, I would sit for hours enjoying the work of John Gould's artists, particularly Joseph Wolfe, as well as the early American bird artist, John James Audubon. Looking closely at these pictures gave me a real feeling of being very close to the bird and of seeing all the details that I could not see on birds in the wild. It was like holding the bird in my hand, and thus started my great desire to be able to draw and paint birds. It's the season of love. This next excerpt is from Pete Dunn's Essential Field Guide Companion. And the cool thing about this is that there are no pictures in it at all. These are text descriptions of bird species. This is what he says about American goldfinch. Says potato chip, flies with a dip. Description: a small, tame, acrobatic, vocal, and charming bird. Canary-like, right down to the conical finch-like bill, but more compact with a plumper body and a short, narrow, deeply notched tail that is too petite for the rest of the bird. Bright yellow males with jet black caps, wings, and tail are unmistakable. Except for blackish wings and tails, winter males, females, and immatures are overall plain and putty colored, with no hint of green on the back, except for a wash of yellow on the face, two almost equal-sized, bold, broad, buffy or creamy, not white, wing bars, and white undertail coverts. The expression is sleepy. Can you make your bird look sleepy? And the last thing I'm going to share with you is a very, very short poem by the American poet Sarah Teasdale from the 1930 edition of Stars Tonight. It's called Summer Evening. Evening, and all the birds in a chorus of shimmering sound are easing their hearts of joy for miles around. The air is still and sweet. The first few stars are white. Oh, let me, like the birds, sing before night. There's your inspiration. Now notice I didn't give you any warning again. I just took that poor bird away from you. So if you want to keep drawing it, you can check out the post on my website and scroll down and that bird is in there. And I invite you to do that. You know, you can download those and keep working with them. Use your own photos. I think that the nature journaling process is inherently emotional and pleasing, and it should be. And when we look at art, it ought to evoke emotion in us, even if it is scientific. I think you saw from Maria Sevilla Marion and from Elizabeth Gould, those were lush, rich, beautiful illustrations. There's a lot of passion that went into creating them. And I think it's perfectly appropriate that we feel that. So toward the end of this, I just have a few minutes left and it's not going to take very long. I'm going to share with you one artist process. I did learn this process, so I know I'm not the only one who follows it. But typically when I'm doing a bird portrait, and my goals are aesthetic, I want to get people fired up and excited about birds. I set some goals and then do research. There's a lot of drawing. I create a composition, and finally I get to render. So if you remember the movie The Karate Kid and how frustrated he was with the whole wax on, wax off thing, there's a lot of wax on, wax off before getting to the karate, but it's worth it. So I wanted to make sure that I understood the owl. I hadn't seen this bird. I still haven't seen this bird in the wild. I hadn't illustrated very many owls. So I had a lot of work to do just to make sure I could understand the photographs. Risa Foster-Bruder had given me some really nice photos to work from. I had to choose an appropriate one and then learn how to see it. It's a strange process to look at a photo and realize that you don't understand what you're seeing in the photo, but I didn't. There were color and size requirements that I had to work on. Didn't want it to be too big. And then I have some experience with my color pencils, knowing that some of those colors don't reproduce well. So I had to make some choices there. And then I always want to try to tell a good visual story. So the photos from Risa were where I began. And then I supplemented those with resources like these. So now I'm taking you out to Birds of the World, which is from Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And if it allows me to sign in, I can show you all this cool scientific stuff that I can sometimes barely read, but at the very least, I have color information and a lot of measurement information. So even though I can't get out there and measure the bird, I can see what the general measurements are and compare that to what I'm doing. US Fish and Wildlife has this great feather atlas. Maybe you find a feather on the ground and you want to ID it. This is a good place to try to do that. And also as an illustrator, sometimes I can't see something in a photo. This will help me understand again what I might be looking at. And then of course I had field guides and other books that I could use. So it came down to 2 photos. And if you remember from the Sibley book, he illustrates these 2 postures. And I really think that camouflage posture is a little scary. I don't know why, but it didn't speak to me nearly as much as that active posture. And I loved this light that was coming in here. And I came up with a story that kind of a visual story that I thought I could tell based on this. As I mentioned, I had a lot of learning to do. It's perfectly okay to struggle. I think that this sketch is kind of a struggle, but I had all of that great reference material, and I was reproducing the photo, but not in a way of tracing it. I really worked to understand what I saw, and it's very hard to render something if you don't understand what you're looking at. So I also looked at other photos of birds, other photos of long-eared owls from different positions, and I looked at websites that talked about the anatomy of owls and how the eyes came into the head, all to try to better understand it and learn to see the bird itself. When I went to composing, I was using some classical composing techniques. This big triangle is very stable. So that's a nice way to compose an illustration when you can. And then a technique that we sometimes use is to hide other shapes in the illustration that help guide the eye where you want it to go. Even though you would not be likely to miss that face, other parts of the illustration just move the eye generally where you want it to go. And so creating a kind of a way to see what you intend, the artist can kind of guide your eye. The story that I decided to tell was about the bird taking off to hunt. And so I love circles also, so I put the moon in here. So simple and suggestive, but kind of fun. At that point, I was ready to really get ready for rendering. And this next part is maybe a little different than some people work. I don't use color pencil on paper anymore. I use a plastic drafting film that is frosted on both sides and allows me to lay down the color pencil. So what I need in order to do that is a kind of a sandwich. And I have a little movie here, how I put that sandwich together, but it's foam core with a contour drawing, which is kind of like my treasure map all cleaned up, and then the translucent drafting film on top. I also do sometimes value studies and texture and color studies. And what that lets me do is work out all kinds of problems ahead of time. So before I get to the colored pencils, I will hopefully have solved all sorts of problems that will trip me up later. I always forget something and end up having to erase some section of the colored pencil, but I try to not do that. So here's a quick film showing retracing kind of a dirty drawing so that I get something clean to work from. And this is what I'm going to be looking at when I start putting the colored pencil down, but I'm not going to look at it directly because it's going to be under my drafting film. So I'm going to lay it down on my foam core, tape it down. And then you'll see this kind of see-through, really thin, frosted film that's gritty on both sides. I can actually work on both sides of it. And then I'm ready to go. I can see that drawing right through it. At some point that gets to be, it gets in the way. And so once I get enough colored pencil laid down, I'll take that contour drawing out of there. But I'm ready to go to rendering. And again, if I've solved all my problems, then it's pretty straightforward. And this is actually one of the shorter parts of the project. It still takes me 3 to 5 weeks to do one of these, which is ridiculous, but there's a lot of detail. I love that detail. And I apply the color pencil in really sheer layers. And at this point, I'm thinking a lot about light on form and getting feathers to look like feathers. You can see that I was pretty messy at this stage, but it all gets smoothed out by the end. This is a completely different illustration. It's one that I just finished. And because I didn't have this process for the long-eared owl, I wanted to be able to show you what it looks like when I'm putting the color pencil down. You'll see that I pick up a lot of different colors. Sometimes I'm working very, very light, like whisper thin, and other times I'll put that pencil up on its tip, apply more pressure, and mark in some details, and get the darks in. And this is almost finished. So here again is like the whole process. So what can you do if you want to get into some of this? I've seen a lot of classes, workshops through Peak Radar here in Colorado Springs. If you're somewhere else in the country, check out your county and city resources. The city parks often have ranger-led or volunteer-led programs in nature sketching. I mentioned John Muir Laws. I don't know why it's doing that. This is his website, and if you click on Nature Journal, he just has so many resources. He has free online workshops. He's a great speaker. His books are wonderful. It's hard to go wrong with him. I have several of his books. He has a book on teaching. If you're a teacher, he has a book on teaching nature journaling too, which is great. This is more spendy, the Bird Academy from Cornell Lab. You may have taken some birding courses through here, but you can see they have a nature sketching class also. And then David Sibley has a great website. And one of the things that I discovered recently was that he has his own little video on drawing an American goldfinch. And you can check that out and play that for yourself. That's really fun. If you want to get more generally into drawing and painting, there's a national and international organization called the Guild of Natural Science Illustrators. They have a conference. They're pretty serious, but really good resources. Denver Botanic Gardens School of Botanical Art and Illustration, which is where I took classes. They've been doing a great job during the pandemic with online classes. Linda Feltner has taught there as a guest. She also is a past president of the Guild of Natural Science Illustrators, and she's at the Sonoran Desert Museum in Arizona. I haven't been able to take a class with her there, but I would love to. And DBG just had a bird class that I missed, so check them out. And then locally, of course, Bemis School of Art. And again, if you're somewhere else in the country, there will be similar art schools, and bird art is getting really popular. So there seem to be more workshops and classes in that. My little cats here are watching their favorite bird video. And there's nothing wrong with also just watching the birds with intention. We can learn something that way too. So references for posterity, you can check that out on the recorded version. There's that finished illustration, and I'll pop back out of here and answer any questions.